All right. So we actually had this class a couple of days ago um, at one of our sponsoring title companies. So it was live, and it was for 2 hour CE credits towards contracts renewal. But for some technical difficulties, we weren't able to record it. So just going to run through it for a couple of my team members that weren't able to actually attend. So what we really presented was more so the TREC updates, right? But it's a HOA addendum class. But because the TREC updates were so fresh on everybody's mind, we went ahead and opened with that. And then we talked about the HOA addendum side by side, if you will. So without further ado, let's hop right in. I think I can make the screen full size by doing that. Okay. So again, it was a 2 hour credit, but we're not worried about that for this scenario. Went over the track updates, as I mentioned, HOA addendum, filling out the HOA addendum, and then some other information about delivering subdivision and um, fees and deposits. Basically, the bottom four items are about HOA and the addendum that we use for that. I always like to start most of my classes by just kind of going through the state of real estate, the state of the real estate market, right? One of the things that, this time last year, we were all, um, you know, nervously, right? Nervously waiting to see what effect the NAR settlement was going to have on the market. So fast forward, um, today is the last week of February. So it took effect several months ago. So here's some numbers, right? NAR membership, NAR forecasted an 8% decline from 1.5 million to 1.4, right? That's NAR's forecast. That's still a ton of members, right? 1.4 million members is still a pretty healthy number. Listing commissions, 60 days post settlement, the average listing commission increased, not by much, but 0.014%, right? So again, not by much. In the same token, 60 days post settlement, the average buyer agent compensation decreased by 0.055. Again, not by much. So these three numbers, the membership, the commissions for listing and buyer's agent, kind of says that it wasn't the doomsday that was being forecasted or predicted or there was a lot of propaganda last year. Let's just call it what it is, right? But we can see the numbers show that the settlement hasn't had a catastrophic, hasn't really had much of an effect on the industry. So I'm here in North Texas, and we're showing that the median price, as of the most recent report, which was January's report, was showing us that we're at about 328 median price, which is up 1% over last year. And the interest rates, right? Mortgage interest rates. I personally thought that the election year was going to have was going to allow the rates to really drop, but we're looking at about 7%. 6.96 is what I have as far as the most recent numbers that I pulled. And that's for the 30-year fixed, and then 6.16 for a 15-year fixed, right? And overall, I think the key thing is just to keep in mind that um, real estate is still a major driver of economic growth, right? So regardless of what we're seeing, what's happening, as long as we keep that in mind, you know we're fine, right? We're fine, we're gonna be fine. So anyway, I always like to share that tidbit of to just I call it the state of the real estate market, right? Just to let us kind of get a temperature gauge on what's really going on. So hopping right in, one of the first things that was changed is about natural resources. So I'll toggle back and forth. This is a draft copy, which shows the red line edits, right? So clearly you can see here that geothermal was just the language that was added, right? To say any natural resources, oil, gas, minerals, geothermal, water, wind. Geothermal is basically it's a renewable resource that's under your house, right? So if you have a lease out for that, if somebody's leased that from you, then now paragraph 4 allows it to be properly recorded. Um, let's see, paragraph 6, right? So 6 talks about surveys. Let me pull it up. I don't want to get too much on a soapbox about surveys. So I'll really do my best not to, but I just might. So bear with me. Paragraph 6 talks about surveys. Personally, I don't recommend any buyer to buy a house without getting their own survey. Okay. So we're talking about 6C here, right? Basically what the change says is a seller, right? We used to have a T-47. That was an affidavit. It needs to be notarized. Now we have a T-47.1, which is a declaration, right? Which doesn't require a notarization. Here's my thing about surveys. It is a document between the owner, in which case it's usually the buyer that's buying the survey, and the survey company. Okay. So if you own the survey, that means at one point you were buying a house and you got a survey. You could transfer that to somebody else, but that new person doesn't have privity with the survey company, right? Again, try not to go on the soapbox here, but just follow me. Event that there's a problem with the survey a year or 2 or 5 later, what the person that actually has the survey in their possession wants to be able to do is call the survey company and say, hey, there's a problem. However, if you just got that through a T-47, where there's the affidavit or the declaration, then you really don't have privity. And that's just a fancy word of saying you don't have standing, right? That's another way of saying you can't just go to the survey company and ask them to do this thing for you, because really they don't owe you anything, right? Their contract, their relationship was with the person that bought it, right? So anyway, it's a small thing that I think we should all pay better attention to. Um, Pay attention to the survey, because at the bottom it's in fine print, right? And most knows that I don't like to wear that lawyer hat, but unfortunately, it's usually right there on my desk. And so occasionally I put it on, right? And the key thing is, when you read that actual survey, one of the footnotes, one of the bottom lines in there says something along the lines of, this document is for the exclusive, right? Emphasis on exclusive use of, and then it names a person, right? So you want to make sure that that's the buyer's name, right? So that if and when you have a problem with a survey, you are able to to contact the survey company, and they will be more than happy to help you, compared to if that name is 3 owners ago, right? And you're just relying on a declaration or an affidavit that's been passed down the line. So again, that's the new language, right? 6C was amended to include the option for providing a T-47.1 declaration of a T-47 affidavit, right? And the key thing to remember here is that in the event that your T-47, that the existing survey is not accepted by title or the lender down the road, which is usually a week or 2 before you find out that it's not, then the language also says that buyer no longer has the right to terminate under paragraph 2B of the third party amendment. Let me hop to paragraph 2B real quick so we can see what exactly it says. This paragraph 2, approval of financing, and 2B is property approval, right? So 2B says if there's lender determined that the property does not satisfy underwriting requirements, then basically buyer can terminate, right? And not risk their earnest money. So property approval, what the new language, right now we're back to paragraph 6C1 is saying is if it's because you chose a T-47 declaration or a T-47 affidavit, no longer have the option to opt out, right? Based on paragraph 2 of the third party addendum. Okay. And all of this is, I'm walking through it. I might be talking fast, so feel free to reach out, comment, text, whatever, and we could take a deeper dive. But I just want us to run through it real quick, just so that we can make it break it down into bite-sized. All right. So 6E, right? Basically, what we're doing here, we're just adding mold remediation certificate, right, as one of the items. Let me pull it up here. So this is 6E, and here's the language here. So 6E has a handful of different things that different notices, right? And so what we're if if the property has been remediated for mold, then seller must provide um, the information, the certificate, right? And then, we're here in Texas, and with whether we want to call it climate change or just more intense storms, whatever you want to call it, right? Um, More and more homes are getting treated for mold because they got flooded. And so, with that said, it became necessary to add the certificate for mold remediation as one of the documents that should be provided. And of course, the next line down, 6E12, adds specific types of notices that should be listed in the paragraph. So when we think of these notices here, I want us to think about the PIDs, the MUDs, right? All those different acronyms that the builders are usually throwing at us when we are walking some of their properties. And I think to to not belabor the point, let me pull it up here. And so the language says following notices have been given, right? Or are attached to, for example, utility, water, drainage, and public improvement districts, right? It used to just said MUD, WCID, PIDs, and so on and so forth, right? So real quick, most of these notices, let me step back. You would If you were the listing agent and your client, the seller, may or may not know if you are in that, okay, if any one of these districts affects you or not, okay. So for the mandatory utility districts, and basically everything except for the public improvement districts, you would find that out through TCEQ, right? That's the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ. For the PIDs, that's through the appraisal district, right? That's how you would know if you fell into any one of those districts or if any one of those notices is required for your listing. Okay, let's move on. The fun steps. So I think most everybody that came to the class, like I mentioned a few days ago, really came so we could talk about paragraph 12, right? Paragraph 12 is one of the most relevant paragraphs that was triggered by the settlement, our settlement. So let's pull it up and we will make light work of it, or at least try. Okay, so as you can see here, 12A1 has a section A, B, and C. What I want us to really focus on here is just to realize that what the NAR settlement was trying to accomplish is to make sure that nobody is assuming that the, what would we call it? That the commissions are fixed, right? That was all the lawsuit was about. handful of people thought that there was price fixing, and so it triggered a bunch of upset people. And next thing you know, we're putting in a lot of things to make sure that the public knows that none of it is fixed. Okay, so let's hop into A1. A1 saying that pay the following expenses, and it's a request, right? So the buyer, because you have to remember the buyer's who's filling this out and submitting it to the seller, right? Um, and so A1 goes through all of the different things that um, seller will pay for. Okay. Now, A1A basically says, hey, of course, seller will pay to make sure that seller can give a clear title, right? So pay off on the existing lien and so on and so forth. Okay. And we will all pay our fair share of our closing costs. Okay. Now, B goes in and asks that the seller will help the buyer's brokerage fees, right? B says seller will allocate X amount of dollars, okay, towards the buyer's brokerage fees, whether it's a dollar amount or a percentage amount. Okay. Now, there's a couple of school of thoughts that thinks that, or that when you look at paragraph 12A1B and you with what's listed in, and I'm going to skip around real quick to the broker information page, okay? Which at the bottom of it, you can see that some language was also added, right? Some people are under the impression that if you have a number in 12A1B and a number here, and those numbers, let's say, for example, they equal $10,000, right? But your listing, let me step back, your brokerage buyer's rep agreement says $8,000. Even though your language here, right, under the broker information page and 12A1B equals 10, the fact that you have 8 as your number in the buyer rep agreement, that's what you'll end up getting. Okay. So let me see if I can simplify that a little bit more. In the scenario that a seller is not allocating any buyer agent compensation, so no BAC. If seller says, I have 0 BAC, this is where you, the buyer's agent, can request X amount of dollars or percentage to be applied towards the brokerage fee that the buyer has agreed to pay in the buyer rep agreement. Okay. In other words, if your buyer rep agreement says $10,000 and the seller has made it clear that there's no BAC for this transaction, then here is where you can ask for up to $10,000, right? Now, let's think of another scenario. If the seller has made it known that the BAC is 1%, okay, 1%, that means on that brokerage information page that we just looked at on this page here, that means that you would have 1% in this section right here, right? You put 1% here. However, because your buyer rep agreement calls for $10,000, then you would put the balance, okay? You would put the balance, the difference in paragraph 12A1B. Okay. So that at the end of the day, what you're asking, and it's just a request, like everything else on all of our contracts, everything's negotiable. So what you're trying to negotiate here is a position for your buyer's brokerage fee to get paid by the seller. Okay. And then 12A1C basically just says an amount not to exceed. This is what we were all used to, right? C used to be in B, and then now the updated, we have C that allocates for X amount of dollars to be applied for, we'll call it the normal closing cost. Okay. So again, it's numbers, and so it's hard to just talk numbers. But I hope that that was about as clear as mud. But we really did spend quite a bit of time on this in the class. And one of the things that I always make sure we do in a class setting is to be as interactive as possible. And so yeah, during this day, there was a lot of just a lot of back and forth, a lot of chatter, right? To the point where I almost needed a gavel to get the to get the class back in order. But we took our time to make sure that there was no scenario or no question that we didn't address during this portion. Okay. Again, call, text, comment if you want to take a deeper dive into any of this. And of course, the compensation disclosure in the broker information is what I was showing us, that this was also modified to, it used to say as referenced in the MLS, right? So we took that language out and allocated for an easier way to put a dollar amount or a percentage. Okay, so on the other document, the third party financing addendum, we main thing that changed was in this section here, and main thing that was added was to say that in the event that the buyer or the property is not due to a lender, then a written a notice of termination, right, along with, right, the keyword here, and a copy of a written statement from the lender setting forth the reasons, right, is required. Okay, so that's the main thing that was added on this approval section. Okay, and then of course, B is very similar, right? We're just talking about the property approval versus the buyer approval, right? Key takeaway there is there needs to be a written statement from the lender, right? Along with the notice of termination based on that paragraph 2A. Okay. There was a handful of additional changes on improved property contracts, backup contracts, and then there's a new addendum for 1031 exchange. We really didn't get into those different sections just because if you're playing with any one of those contracts on improved, backup, or 1031, the competency level is a little higher. And so, just know that some changes were made to that. And if and when you need to use any one of those documents, start with your broker, right? Start with your broker, and it's case by case. So I'd say, in the scenario that one of these three contract or amendment needs to be handled, again, comment, get with somebody that has enough competence in those sections to really walk you through it. Okay, so then we get into the HOA. One of the first things that we did is just to kind of go through the different terminologies, and there's a lot of it, and of course, there's a slide deck that people got to take home. And I'm not a big fan of reading my slide deck to people, but just know that we went through a handful of different terms that are relevant to the HOA addendum, right? And I also want us to just be real, right? HOA is one of those things where you love it when you love them, and then of course when you're done, when you don't love them, it's a real love-hate relationship, right? If you want to have a STR, short-term rental, in a subdivision, at that moment, you probably don't want the HOA to stop you. However, right, if you want to, if you have a home, right, if you have a home in a subdivision and you don't want your neighbors to use theirs for short-term rentals, then all of a sudden you're excited about the HOA, right? HOAs are by design restrictive, okay? Covenants, right? Conditions, restrictions. That's the main thing that HOAs are about. I just pulled up the page here, right? CC&Rs or declaration, that's what we call it, right? Which defines the contractual obligation of the HOA, okay? That's that they're designed to govern and protect the interests of all its members, okay? So again, when you want to do an Airbnb, yes, you might not care for the HOA, but when you don't want an Airbnb in your neighborhood, all of a sudden the HOA comes across as the hero, right? One of the comments that came in during the conversation yesterday or the other day when we had the course was about one of our agents in the class, and her client bought a house. I didn't ask the price point, but sounded like $1 million house, and bought it because the HOA does not allow rentals or Airbnb, short-term rentals. Okay. And next thing her client knows, she sees both. She sees a rental and a short-term rental in the subdivision and is livid, right? Like, wait, I only moved over here because the covenants and restrictions says that none of that exists over here, right? What do you do? Okay. So of course, that's recent. That just happened. The home was just, they just closed on the home within the last 30, 40 days. So it's, to be determined. However, just know that just because the HOA says no doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. At the same time, just know that once the HOA sends a notice for you to stop and the fine starts to accumulate, HOA can sooner or later have a high enough lien on the property due to all the fees and penalties, and they can foreclose on the home for you owing so much money to the HOA. Okay. Don't want to say it's rare, but it's not every day that that happens, but just know that it can. Okay. So that's the thing about HOA. Paint your paint your garage and it's not one of the colors that's approved, you're probably going to get a notice to paint it back. Yes, as an owner, you can posture and tell them that, well, it's my house, I bought it, da, da, da. But however, HOA says these are the accepted colors for our garage, right? Same thing with the grass, same thing with a lot of different moving pieces. HOA does get a final say on whether or not it's approved. Um, and if it's not approved and you get a notice to take it down, the best thing is to take it down and then make your argument rather than make your argument while it's still up and rack up um, a bunch of fees and penalty opinion. Okay, so the HOA document, it's really just a one-page document, right? It's a very powerful document in the grand scheme of things because what this document says is, at the end of the day, you're about to buy this property as the buyer, and you want to make sure that you have an opportunity to review the subdivision information to make sure that the restrictions and the covenants and all those that's applicable to this property is doesn't offend you, if you will, right? If you're a big fan of red grass, for example, and the subdivision information, the restrictive covenant says no, it has to stay green, then you want to make sure that you are on the same page with that and know that no, you cannot have red grass in this neighborhood. Otherwise, the HOA just might try to um, force you into becoming a green grass lover. So information is defined in paragraph A. to mean a copy of the restrictions applying to the subdivision and the bylaws of the association. The resale certificate, which basically allows the current owner to transfer the property to the next person. So 1, 2, or 3A, 1, 2, or 3, basically just trying to allocate who will pay for the subdivision information. Okay, so with 1 showing that it's the seller, right? Seller shall pay for, obtain, and deliver. B shows that the buyer, right, shall obtain, pay for, and deliver. And then 3 just suggests that the buyer's already received and approved, right? And, right, operative void there, received and approved the information, okay? And that the buyer does not require an updated resale certificate, okay? So my default, if you will, would be to get it updated, to ask the seller to provide the information. Whether 10 days, whether 15 days, just know that it's not always. The title company usually requests it, right, from whatever information is provided up here, as far as the property, the HOA association's name and an address or phone number. HOA associations are a lot quicker at getting the document over. Some are a little slower. Now, I want us to look at the second paragraph in this section. And it's in both A1 and A2, and also in A3. Okay, so that basically says that if and when the subdivision information is delivered, buyer may terminate within 3 days of receiving the subdivision information or prior to closing, whichever occurs first, and earnest money will be refunded. Okay, same thing here. If buyer obtains the subdivision information, buyer may terminate. Okay, same thing here. Buyer may terminate this contract, and earnest money will be refunded. I just want you to know that this HOA addendum has a lot of power in the sense that if you get that subdivision information and you find out that you have to pay $2,000 a month for HOA dues and you don't want to live with that, or you find out that you can't keep your grass red because you really like red grass, this is where you say, oh, no, that's just too restrictive for me and my family. I'm out. Okay. So that's the main thing that's happening in that section there. Let me see here. This edit was actually made in 2022. Okay, but I still have the red line version just because I wanted to show us what it used to say versus what it says now. Okay, so the edit in C is basically saying that this paragraph doesn't apply to the regular maintenance fees and assessments or dues. Okay. At the end of the day, C is asking how much of the cost to transfer this property will the buyer pay, right? So it says buyer shall pay any and all association fees, deposit reserves, not to exceed X amount of dollars, okay? Again, if I was just going to go with the default number, maybe I'll put $100 there, okay? But I wanted us, and our title company made a good point to remind us that sometimes some of this resale certificate and some of the different fees are, depending on the HOA, because each HOA gets to determine how much it is, are quite high. And so if you put $1 here and it ends up being $3,000 to get it, then the seller is surprised by an extra, $3,000 that they didn't account for in their net proceeds, right? If they did do a net proceeds worksheet. Bottom line is nobody knows request the subdivision information, what these numbers are. And this new language is just basically this paragraph does not apply to the regular periodic maintenance fees and so on. That's just basically saying, hey, look, we're not talking about what the normal association dues were. We're not talking about what the seller might owe, might currently owe to the HOA. We're talking about the actual cost to transfer the property, right? So again, whether it's $100 or $1 or whatever you and your buyer are hoping to negotiate, you'd put that number in C. Okay. And then D's basically just giving the title company the authorization to know who to bill, right? Who to bill for the cost of obtaining the information. Overall, I think it's safe to say, one of our takeaways is always trying to remind, each other that there's so much more to sales price on each real estate deal. Based on all the new updates and even just looking at the HOA addendum and the third party financing, we know that price doesn't take up, a whole page. Go back to page 1 of the actual contract, right? So paragraph 3 talks about prices. It talks about the sales price, and there's, at least on this document alone, there's another 11 pages. And then the third party document is another 2 pages. Then you have the HOA document, another page. So there's a lot more than just price. So I want us all to always remember that. And also to remember that a well-drafted HOA addendum represents an opportunity for your offer to be extra competitive, right? It just does. It's just it's a fact, right? And one of the things that our title company always tries to remind us, and we should all be cognizant of, is always remember to fill out paragraph 21 of the actual contract, right? Because all this notices, all this stuff that we're talking about, that's how we know who to communicate it to. Yes, as the agent, you might say, okay, I'll just get it to the other agent, and from there, it's, but just for liability reasons, it's always best practice, right? To make sure that paragraph 21 notices, right? When the buyer is submitting this form, the buyer might not have the seller's information to fill it out, right? But of course, it says notice will be delivered to buyer at, and it has buyer's information with a copy to buyer's agent. So yeah, it allows for the agent to have a copy and the seller's agent to have a copy. But do know that this section is very important. And a lot of us just take it for granted because, like I said, when the buyer's submitting this offer, they usually don't have the seller's information to add. Normally we will pause here for Q&As. Of course, my contact information here. And the last thing that our lawyers always requires us to put up here is that this material is just for informational purposes, right? It shouldn't be considered a substitute for, an advice from an attorney or a tax specialist, right? So not your CPA, we're not your attorneys. We're just here sharing some information after we've parsed it. And of course, most of the time that we're sharing this, the attendees do get some CE hours to apply towards their credit. So, like I mentioned during the presentation a couple of different times, comment, text, call. I'd love to hear your feedback and hopefully don't get a lot of what's the word that they use when you're being trolled. Well, I'm not looking towards getting trolled or anything, but I do want to remain available and engaged throughout this whole process. All right. Take care.